Hi, I'm Michael Neuenschwander with Outlook Wealth Advisors, a CPA and certified financial planner. Today we're going to tackle one of those great questions, Roth conversions. So somebody who came to us and said, well, I'm 65, I've got 1.4 million in my IRA account, should I be doing Roth conversions? So first, let's back up and take a little bit and say, well, what is a Roth conversion? What is a Roth IRA? I know that may be pretty basic for some of you, but let's kind of tackle it first. A Roth IRA is sort of almost the opposite of your traditional IRA. When you put money into a Roth IRA, you get no tax break, or in the case of a Roth conversion, meaning you're going to pay the tax early for the long-term benefit of having everything it grows to be completely tax-free. And so that's the basis of what is, a Roth or a Roth conversion. There's some other details we'll touch on, how the rules are different when it comes to required distributions. The rules are a little different for inherited Roths as well. But let's get one thing off the bat first. For most people, a Roth conversion is quite honestly a tax question. So we can run the math and we'll show you if taxes never changed, if today's tax rate stayed the same for next year, 5 years, 10 years, the rest of your life, the reality is there's no benefit to a Roth conversion. So if taxes stay exactly the same, whether you pay the taxes now and it grows tax-free, or whether you grow the money and you pay the taxes later, you will end up in the exact same place. However, the moment taxes go up at all, the Roth IRA potentially gives you a better return and a better outcome. Now, I'd argue in today's tax environment, when we look and say we've got a current tax law that expires in the not too distant future, obviously Congress and the president could change that at any moment. But if you're married today, I'd also argue that it's almost with a certainty that your taxes are going to go up, because at some point, one of you files as a single taxpayer again. And then ultimately, in this case, if you have $1.4 million and you didn't spend all of it, and some of that money goes on to kids or beneficiaries, well, odds are they're still working when they inherit that money, so they're going to pay taxes on it at that point in time, potentially on top of their income. So when we get some of the basics out about what a Roth conversion is, or does it even potentially make sense for you, you have to be convicted or convinced that taxes are going to at least get a little worse in the future. Otherwise, the Roth conversion may not make sense, at least in your particular case. But now that we have that out of the way, let's dig into our scenario. So if you've got somebody who's 65, they've got a healthy amount in their IRA, one of the considerations we begin to look at, in this case, they didn't indicate, but it's one of the most critical questions, what does your income today look like? And if we look at basic tax brackets, today we operate under a 12% tax bracket, which for a married couple takes you to a little above $100,000 of gross income. You've got a 22% tax bracket, again, for a married couple, gets you to about $200,000 of gross income. And then you've got a 24% bracket, which gets that same married couple all the way up to a little over $400,000 of income. But that's only the income tax. There are several other things we'll touch on here in just a few minutes, such as IRMAA, extra taxes, investment taxes that come into play the higher your income is. So if we start off quite simply and said, if somebody was 65 years old, they had 1.4 million, but their lifestyle in retirement, the income they needed to live off of, let's just say $10,000 a month, $120,000 a year. Well, based on that, they would be largely in the 22% marginal tax bracket. But they would also have room in that same tax bracket for roughly another $80,000, $90,000 without going into a higher bracket. So that's one of the first things you should think about. So whether you're like in this case, 64, 65 with almost $1.5 million, or whether you're 63 with 500,000, whether you're 67 with 2 million, the thought process of what you need to take into account for a Roth conversion is the same. So back to this case, look, say, if they have regular income or what they need to live off of is approximately 120,000, even then you need to get into how much of that is Social Security, how much of it is pension, how much of it has to come out of their retirement account for them to actually live off of. And the reason that's so important too is it said, suppose their expenses were way out of line, and it said they're going to still spend $300,000 a year as if that was their income when they were still working. Well, then the reality is that $1.4 million is going to be gone in 5 or 6, 7 years. So at that point, Roth conversions may not make a whole lot of sense if they're consuming almost all the money in a short length of time. So partially, you got to make sure, does your retirement picture actually work? Which, as we've shared in other videos, going back to using tools like a retirement cash flow or a Monte Carlo scenario, at least make sure your retirement picture is on the right track before you go too far down the road on focusing on Roth conversions and tax strategy. So as we look at this particular case, they've got a couple. It says, yep, 64, overall expenses are within reason. Should they be looking at a Roth conversion? And we just said, based on their current income, they could likely fit another $80,000 to $90,000 within their current tax bracket without having to go up in taxes. However, I mentioned this word IRMAA a minute ago, and it really stands for an income-related monthly adjustment amount. Quite simply, it says the more income you show, the more you have to pay for Medicare. Now they're 65, so Medicare is definitely, in the mix for them. One little nuance on IRMAA, for those of y'all that this may apply to, they actually look at it 2 years early. So they start looking at it at age 63, and they look at it every single year. And today that level basically says if you have gross income more than $216,000, congratulations, you have enough income, you simply get to pay more for Medicare than everybody else, so to speak, than your neighbor. So you have to take IRMAA into account when you're looking at Roth conversions to say, does that extra amount of tax still make it make sense? There are also things like the 3.8% investment tax that come into play. That would apply to dividends, interest. So there's more to it than simply the surface of what tax bracket are you in. The other thing we need to look at is we're going to fast forward a little bit into the future, which I know is always a little bit dangerous, but if we looked and said, here's the income picture today, what does the income picture look like when we get to required distributions, those forced distributions that they make you take out of your traditional IRA or 401k? For most people, that starts at age 73 today. If you're younger, it may even go out to 74, 75. But those numbers start at just a touch under 4%. So we could take someone's tax picture today, and in this case, let's say they were in the 22% bracket, but fast forward a few years and say, well, because of required distributions forcing more income out, and if the current tax law expires as it's projected to, says instead of being in the 22% bracket in a few years, they're going to find themselves really in the 28% bracket. And then, as we said right in the beginning, if tax rates are going up, then it likely makes sense to begin doing Roth conversions. Then we often take that one step farther. It says, what should happen if one of them were to pass away? So even if income goes down, so typically the smaller Social Security check will go away. If income goes down, but expenses still remain 70, 80% of what they were as a couple, that single spouse may now find themselves still in that 28% tax bracket. So all of that begins to point us towards that this couple may be a good candidate for Roth conversions. Then we begin to decide, well, how much and how do you pay the taxes? Some of those go hand in hand. So the first level for many people is simply using up the tax bracket that you're already in. In this case, 22%. As we said, they may have about $80,000 worth of room. But depending on the growth of their IRA, so this comes back and becomes an investment question too, depending on the growth of their IRA, if it continues to grow throughout retirement, even if they're doing some modest Roth conversions, even if a required distribution comes into play, then it may make sense to get more aggressive and say, don't stop at that 22% bracket. If they're going to be in 28% in the long run, or if the IRA continues to grow, maybe they need to be thinking about Roth conversions into the 24% bracket as well. And that would subject them to IRMAA, those higher Medicare expenses, but that is also a tiered system. So the first level of IRMAA is actually not that bad. It's about another $80 per month, per person. So it's just one of the calculations you take into account to determining if a Roth conversion makes sense for you. And then, well, what's the benefit? Suppose we do a Roth conversion, we get some of those taxes out of the way early. So we're going to voluntarily pay some tax at that 22, potentially 24% rate. But this is where the computers and the math helps. Is if we take a picture and say, here's what the taxes look like if we voluntarily do this, or here's what the taxes look like if we do not. And over the course of someone's lifetime, we can see that the benefit of being proactive in this area is typically not $5,000 or $10,000 of savings, but typically 5 and 6 figures of savings on taxes over their lifetime. And as we take this one step farther, one of the benefits to the Roth IRA, there is no required distribution. So if you don't want to take the money out or you don't need to take the money out, you don't have to. And even if it goes on to the next generation, you leave part of the Roth IRA to children and grandchildren, they do have a required distribution, but it is also completely tax-free to them as well. So there are a lot of positives to doing a Roth conversion. What's the negative? Well, the negative is you got to pay the tax. And there are a few strategies we'll end up touching on, both in this video and then in a little more depth in a video coming up, which is how do you minimize those taxes along the way? There are strategies of saying, can you pay it right up front? Should you pay it from IRA money, or should you pay it from outside money if you have that capability? Or in other cases, if you're charitably inclined and doing things anyway, can you increase your deduction so you actually owe less on the Roth conversion to begin with? But if we summarize, while there are a lot of moving parts here, for this couple, in that tax bracket of 22% today, 64-year-old couple with $1.4 million in traditional IRAs, if we believe taxes are going up to 24 and 28 in the long run, and they're not going to be spending every penny of what they have in the near term, then Roth conversions definitely seem to be a good strategy for them to reduce some long-term taxes, and even more important, remain in control. They're not forced to take those required distributions and forced up in income when they potentially don't need the higher income down the road. So if this is something that applies to you, or as you said, maybe this isn't your exact case, you're a little younger, a little older, or have a little more, a little less, this is the kind of process you need to go through and take into account these other moving parts when it comes to determining should you be doing a Roth conversion. And sometimes one other little tidbit I'll throw in there as we begin to wrap up, we get another question, well, if I'm already required distribution age, if I'm already 73, can I still do a Roth conversion or should I? I'll answer it quickly here. Yes, you definitely can. You have to do it on top of your required distribution. But short of that, the thought process is the same. If taxes are going to get worse later, even doing Roth conversions after age 73 may make sense. So hope you enjoyed today's video. If this was beneficial to you, make sure you hit subscribe below. If you want more information on some of the tax strategies for paying for the taxes on a Roth conversion, make sure you subscribe. We'll be covering that in a subsequent video. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of the day.